Hello and welcome to the fifth virtual talk in Miss Gard Institute's 6-month series of conversations with leading industry experts. My name is Oliver Farrell. I'm the Education Program Manager at Miss Gard Institute, and I'm your host for this talk. What is contemporary art? Our speaker today is digital art curator, farmer, and co-founder of the online platform African Digital Art. Jepchumba is a curator, a technologist, and a digital ambassador. Alongside founding the online platform African Digital Art, Jepchumba's career has seen her working in podcasting, art markets, as an educator in the growing world of digital art. In 2022, Jepchumba took her vision to the next level, creating the digital marketplace, Nandi, the foremost cultural marketplace for digital goods, which include collectibles, physical art certifications, gaming items, and digital fine art. These items are backed by the carbon negative Cello blockchain. The talk today will be filmed and it will be uploaded to the MISC YouTube account. Today's talk will begin with a presentation and then we will open up the conversation for some questions. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat and we will find some time towards the end to answer them. I would now like to welcome our guest speaker, Jepchumba. Hello.
Hi, hello, hi everybody. So thankful to be here and also just to share with you like what I've been working on, how I've been in this space for a while. I started African digital art about 13 years ago, which is quite a long time. If you think about it in the digital art space, I'm not sure if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties because that's how it always is. But let me just do let me get it off. There we are.
Yeah,
yes,
I can see
there
you now.
we are.
All good.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, so now I feel better. So my name is Jepchumba. I'm originally from Kenya. I'm a digital artist. I've always had an affinity to technology since I was a young child, mainly because technology afforded this way to translate like my crazy ideas like quickly into something that is tangible and feasible. And so when I started African Digital Art, I was mainly, it actually came from a conversation that I had with one of my lecturers. I was doing a master's degree in digital media. And I wanted to focus on African digital art. I was told there's no digital art in Africa because, first of all, there's no electricity. So how could there be digital art? So when African digital art, if you can imagine, 13 years ago, Google Images was something that was sort of new. Like this was before Instagram, before like a lot of the platforms that we're seeing. And for me, like, I think I made it like my personal mission just to change Google Images, like in terms of like how they represented the continent. And it wasn't something that it was only unique to me. A lot of folks, especially from Kenya, who were early adopters of the internet and internet spaces, were really having these conversations about like having the ability for Africans to finally have the chance to speak for themselves, to tell their stories, to tell things about like what they're cared about and their culture and all of that. So African digital art, since when I started 13 years ago, has really become like an archival space for creative practices, like from photography to animation to illustration to even now delving into AI and artificial intelligence and AR and VR. So we've really try to make sure that we are comprehensive and looking at the culture of technology on the continent. And this is also a huge task because the continent is quite huge. We're 54 countries, one of the most diverse places on earth. We have more than 2,000 languages, like different, foods and peoples and all sorts of things. So I'm also sort of trapped in this definition of exactly what Africa is and what Africa represents. So if you could just excuse me, sorry, my son just came in. I don't even know how. Just give me 1 second.
No, absolutely no worries. And on top of everything that Jepchumba is doing, she's also a mother. So I think that this is a really exciting moment for us to sort of look at platforms like African Digital Art and what they represent in the global topic. I was just sort of saying it's incredible the work that you're doing, and that I love this sort of idea of democratized space the internet offers, and what you've managed to do here with African Digital Art by creating a space for African people to tell their stories on the internet and through their art medium.
Yes, and I'm back. Oh, you know, that's the role of having this offline and online space. You're always trying to ensure that you have quiet spaces these days. But yes, exactly. So I want to continue in sharing some artwork that I had created initially as a digital artist. So I really come from this practice as an artist myself, but then have been called into a larger sort of place and position because of the underrepresentation of where we are in terms of like the continent. And I always love sharing this image of like how people perceive the continent, like even from us, like from where we come from, even in Kenya, we're sort of always still trying to navigate exactly what does it mean to be African, what does it mean to like take over certain spaces in technology, not only that, but in culture and resources. So like Africa has always been this submerged, like under our understanding of what this continent is, has always been like very much on the surface level. And for so many people, especially people who are working in culture, it's always seen as like some sort of final frontier. And I think that because of this representation of what Africa is, it's been really important for us to make presence, to ensure that we continue to showcase our culture, continue to share our stories, to continue to showcase like the importance of like why African culture has like a participation in like the entire world in terms of our understanding what it is to be even human. So one of the most powerful things that African digital art offered was, first of all, it was like quite powerful in the beginning because it was the first time many people started seeing themselves in digital culture, started seeing people who look like themselves, like who could like relate to some of the stories that they had heard growing up, but they didn't see necessarily in media. So one of the things that I was always used to get as like a person who was curating digital art was, are you sure this is African? Are you sure this is like, these are things that people were doing on the continent, but you know, Africa does not exist outside of the rest of the world. Like we're in the same 2022 as everybody else is. And this was a very clear distinction for us to make by showcasing the talent that we had on the continent, by showing that people were creating things, 3D images, like cartoons, like projects that like reflected African stories. And it really opened up this space, like by curating African digital art, like especially for me, this question about like what opportunities do we have, in what opportunities does Africa have in terms of participating in our understanding of technology and our understanding of art and under our understanding of culture. So it started as this like little teeny tiny blog, and then sort of expanded into this huge conversation about what kind of technologies, what kind of stories could really benefit the rest of the world that came from our continent. So one of the things that I always think about is this quote that I found years ago, that there's not enough Africa there's not enough of the African mind in our computers. Even if you think about like your keyboard, for example, and how it's organized, like it's still like very much like an Anglo-centric sort of keyboard. It's still, even the technologies that you're using to create art are still sort of framed from the people who make it in Cupertino, if you have like a Mac or California, you know. And this is a very important thing to note, because technology has always sort of been marketed as like a democratizing tool, that it's going to enable like everyone now to have a space to talk or to share ideas. But still, like even in organizing, like just the user interface, just like our keyboards, just like how we interact with technologies, it still comes from a very, very specific place. And this is something that is really incredible to note now that we're in but we're in the middle of recovering from COVID-19, where more of us are being pushed away from being, living our offline spaces and being pushed into like having this sort of dual relationship between offline and online. So we're sort of hybrid in nature now, where we have like sort of online identities and offline identities. So like for me, I've been really, really interested in like, as we're adopting, as these technologies from our mobile phones, from our social media accounts, like how, and the fact that they come from a very specific place in the world, how does that influence our culture? Like how does that influence our sense of identity and who we are? So, and that comes even with language, like still like to this day, the internet, the World Wide Web, it isn't so worldwide. It's like majority of the sites that you see or you visit are in English and they're Anglo-centric. And even though there's been like many attempts to ensure that other languages are represented, we're still very far along the way from having other languages like included in these technologies. And this is so important because language is directly related to like how we philosophically think about ourselves as human beings, our relationship with nature, our relationship with each other. So we still have like a ways to go in understanding like the importance of language in these technologies that we adopt. And this is like one of the greatest offerings that I feel like African creative technology culture has for us. And then another thing is that this is also like, I use the slide, like this was during the height of Trump era, where all of discussions, especially in the world, not even just in America, were always sort of made it was always sort of a binary conversation where like even our ideologies were sort of manufactured from like very specific spaces. So as more and more people adopted like participating in social media, we were always sort of being put into like this group versus this group, and like there was not much room for us to have like variations in terms of like our identities and ideas and all sorts of those things. And that's kind of like antithetical to like what exactly the World Wide Web was designed for. We like in the 90s, I don't want to date myself, in the 90s, in the 2000s, early 2000s, the World Wide Web was really, really weird. Like it was much stranger than you think. You could come there as like a pencil, like you could identify yourself as like some object and like sort of live your life in as a blob and like interact with other blobs. And there wasn't this like sort of binary discussions of like you're left, you're right, you're male, you're female, you're this, you're that. It was like the internet in the beginning of the internet like allowed for everybody to just sort of explore all sorts of identities. So like the internet has been this like center of myth making that and ideologies, but has sort of like over the past few years become like even more dogmatic, I would say, in my opinion. And then thinking about like the possibilities of like how African digital arts and even African culture can like sort of participate in our understanding of art and culture is this idea of like creating these spaces for collaborative healing. One of the key things that you'd see is like as more and more events happen across the world, more and more we're seeing more and more instances of like mental illnesses, all sorts of problems. Like not only that, like there's like reactions towards like pandemic, issues of death, issues of all sorts of things that like we as a human species like are having to deal with. And these internet spaces like really, really require African culture and other sort of cultures to participate for us to like come up with new paradigms and new ways of us to like engage in healing, like in figuring out like how best to connect with each other. And then another powerful sort of thing that that I think like African digital art has an opportunity to do, and also has a space in doing, is like for us to have like more centers for imagination and speculative thinking. That's like sort of how I got onto digital art, because you could really create like basically anything, any sort of reality that you could possibly think, but our education systems are not really designed for like speculative thinking and speculative imaginations. And I think that like African digital art certainly has like a way for us to, an opportunity to offer us like ways for us to think about just generating new ideas, generating new realities that don't exist currently. If you like, one of the examples I always use is especially when it comes to Africa, is science fiction movies. When I used to watch science fiction movies, I used to feel so relieved because they would never show Africans. So I'd be like, oh, the apocalypse is not going to happen here, because they would just, Africa was completely absent in conversations about futures, in our imaginations of like, of what 1,000 years would look like. And so I would feel like, phew, if the world came to an end, at least Africa exists in some other sort of space away from this mess. So I think that like African digital art has afforded a lot of creators to start putting Africa in these new speculative ways of thinking and ideas. And then like another opportunity and another amazing thing that African digital art has done, of me being in this practice of African digital art, is considering myself as an archivist. Because of the colonial history that Africa has had, we are sort of like recovering from a global amnesia, like a collective amnesia, where we're trying to piece back our culture from the remnants of colonialism. So we don't really have libraries or like spaces that are dedicated to our own culture. And most of our culture exists in Western spaces. So you have to go to sort of the British Museum to sort of see artifacts like from pre-colonial times. And so my practice in doing African digital art has been, a lot of it has been to ensure that this doesn't happen again, by like sort of taking up space, archiving creative projects, archiving creative ideas as a means to like sort of safeguard the future, so that other generations can see, oh, there was a point in which, you know, Africans were participating in internet culture, and they can go back and like sort of dig into that library. So a lot of the work that I consider myself doing is like being an archivist, like just by showcasing and featuring artists from all over the continent, and now sort of extending African culture like across the globes. Because like even the idea of Africa being this like weird shaped thing, continental thing, is also sort of misleading, because like African culture, like you can find like deep African culture, even African languages in places like El Salvador, Ecuador, in Brazil. Like we eat the same food, we have similar religion, religious belief, similar culture. So even the idea of Africa itself is like outside of like our ideas and notions of boundaries. And so I wanted to just talk about like just like this, from being a curator of African digital art and having all of these kind of things going in my mind about like language, about imagination and speculative thinking. I created a podcast actually called Future Lab Africa. Future Lab Africa is if you can think of it, it's actually a time capsule. And so my audience for Future Lab Africa is not people right now, and people really didn't understand that concept. They were like, you're releasing a podcast, you have to get new users, and there's really this huge push in the internet for things to be recent or popular. But I really wanted to create a podcast for people 100 years from now, who would be listening, trying to understand what it was like to live in this age. And I think that what I found was like, even the digital medium of sound was such a powerful way of having a communication, like a time travel sort of mechanics to like travel between now, the past, the present, and the future through sound, by archiving interviews, by engaging in sort of thought experiments with the future. So a lot of the projects that I do are actually quite futurist in thinking. And I don't want to confuse that with like Afrofuturism, which is another thing that I got labeled at as, because there was this like conception that if you are an African and you like technology, that automatically meant that you're an Afrofuturist. But Afrofuturism actually came from a whole entire movement in the 60s and 70s that really has like very little connection to like African futures. And I really, through this project, wanted to make sure that Africa still had this space in the future, even though it keeps being left out of that conversation. So Future Lab Africa was this invitation to travel through sound by introducing projects and like speculative ideas that like people 100 years from now could engage in and have an understanding of what this time was like, because we're living in a very, very volatile, but also exciting, but also like very transitory time. And I'm not sure like everyone experienced this, but I think that we from our collective memory, we certainly feel like an acceleration of time, and like an acceleration of like a lot of old paradigms like being left very, very quickly. And people, I think there's a sense that a lot of people feel sort of lost in trying to understand like who they are. And the pandemic has only heightened this like more and more. So conversations with the future is like something that I really, really thought it was really important in my practice. So one of the most important things also that I've sort of also been involved in is in the culture of making and introducing a younger population into creating their own versions of technologies, like creating their own hardware. I think it's like more than 70% of our technologies are imported. We have this like assumption that Africa only imports technology, but that is like less and less so the case. Like there's innovators all across the continent who are trying to come up with new technologies that will be used around the world. Like I come from Kenya, where we sort of introduced like mobile money, like the idea of mobile money to the rest of the world when we came up with M-Pesa, which is like our way for transacting. And that also came from just for the fact that like a lot of our systems, like a lot of systems that are adopted in Western spaces usually fail when they are transplanted into many countries across Africa. So our banking system came from like an old colonial paradigm that really, really divorced a lot of the way we engage in culture. For example, in Kenya, we have a relationship between the rural and the urban. And so mobile money was this like this technology of being able to like send money over text message connected this desire that many people had in connecting resources between the urban and rural spaces. That sort of completely changed the way we transacted. It completely opened up like new opportunities for people like to get into like things like farming and sustainable living, and also like thinking about like how to return back to a lot of ways that they had been living in pre-colonial times. So like a lot of the activities that I've been sort of part in like has been engaging more and more young people who necessarily don't feel like comfortable like going to like an IBM or Intel, but can sort of have very, very little interventions and interactions in like creating small things to make them feel like, oh yes, actually I'm a maker. I actually have an opportunity to like make my own headphones or my own sound systems or my own internet or my own like gadgets or things that will work in my environment. And I think it's also kind of intrinsic in a lot of African cultures for us to be innovative, because many of the things that are supposed to work elsewhere really actually don't work. So we are already hacking and breaking things down. It's just like, what can we do to like give people confidence to continue like that kind of culture in terms of like bringing solutions that like we have never really seen before. And I think these kind of activities are going to be more and more important as we're addressing issues around climate change, as we're trying to find like different ways to be sustainable, as we're trying to have like different conversations in terms of our relationships between who we are as people, the goods that we consume, like the phones that we like purchase every year. Like it's like so important for us to have like different understanding of like exactly what technology is, like how should it be used, and how should it have a relationship to like all of our collective well-being. Yeah. And then another thing that sort of another 100-year project that I've been part of was starting a school with my mom in rural Kenya for girls. We opened up a school in Eldoret, which is like in the western part of Kenya where most of like the champion runners come from. And we wanted to, we set up a boarding school for about 180 women, young women, girls, to get them in to an education system that was kind of sort of different from what was presented to them in like from the Kenyan education system. So we have them participate in a lot of like maker activities, like we sort of engage them in digital media projects, in art projects, sort of kind of like shifting them away from this thinking that education has to be this sort of way where you have to compete, where you have to take one exam that determines like the rest of your life and who you will be. And if you fail at that, that's basically it. We wanted to provide young women the opportunity for them to think of ways in which they could also participate in like the global internet technology culture and create jobs for themselves, connect with other people around the world, and also figure out ways to like innovate and create new inventions that we're definitely gonna need as like the planet keeps getting warmer and more institutions sort of start collapsing in and of themselves. It's like really important for our young generation to start thinking outside of what is presented to them, because their reality is going to be much different from the reality that we're living in. And one of the things that's really important to note is that Africa is an extremely young continent. Like 40% of Africa is under the age of 16. So that is like a very different like dynamic if you think about like the majority of people who are going to be leading the world are who are born like after the 2000s, like when I seriously have memories, you know. So we are a very, very young continent, and we have like, we're gonna be definitely taking up more space in like global conversations about like how we're living and how we're engaging with others, and like what kind of industries like we're gonna be invested in. So yeah, so that's Future Lab is the project that I had mentioned before. And then I wanted to just sort of, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I'm sure I'm okay.
Yeah, you're good. No, we've got heaps of time.
Yeah, because I'm like still rolling through these things because I can't see.
No, you got heaps of time.
To bring it back to Nandi and how Nandi came about. As we mentioned in the beginning of the talk, I sort of reluctantly, very reluctant, this must be said, reluctantly entered the NFT space at the beginning last year. I was actually farming. I was very much like invested in being a farmer, but my inbox was like filled with tons of people approaching me saying, oh, you have such a huge collection of African art online. Why don't you just convert it into NFTs and just make buku bucks and everything would change and like your whole life would be transformed. And I kind of like was suspicious about what NFTs are and like what this space looked like. And I really actually had like a hesitancy because it had sort of remnants of things that I've seen before that have led us into trouble, which is like a very homogenous type of group of people who are dominating conversations about what the rest of the world would look like. But there was something incredibly interesting about the NFT space and blockchain, which was the fact that this technology now allowed us to even decentralize like our ideas and our ideas even around intellectual property that could even allow more African people to participate in ways that make more sense to them, like that could invent more spaces, more communities, more technologies, more economies that directly related to them. Like one of the biggest problems that we face on the continent is like majority of our economies are centralized with a dollar. So if like it's like a saying that if, it's a very famous saying, like if America gets the sneeze, like starts sneezing, the rest of the world gets a cold. Like in Africa, when the US or whatever is happening in Europe has issues, it like catastrophically affects our economies and our ways of life, which is quite ironic since like majority of our resources go into sustaining the world. Like if you think about like every single battery that's on your phone comes from Kiva, Congo. So Congo should be the richest country in the world. Like it should be one of the most, it should be like a Switzerland or some other space. But like that's absolutely not the case because of this like long colonial inheritance that we were sort of still living in, that's going to be more and more obscure as we're having younger and younger population of people from the continent coming. So for me, like not this whole jump into like NFT space and Nandi is basically an investigation of like, how can we use and leverage like Web 3.0 tools, like blockchain tools, to like redesign and reconfigure new ways for us to resource back ourselves, and also get into much more like sort of an African way of like organization, which is this like community building, community sharing, community agreement of like organizing our culture. Because like I mean, I've seen so many projects from around the world try to come and like solve Africa's problems. Like, people very idealized people think, well, what Africa needs is like 100 computers, and if we open up a lab somewhere in Lesotho, that would change everybody's lives, like, or if we gave every African child an iPad, that would change everything. But as we're seeing more and more, things are much more complex, and like these sort of issues should be invited for much more participation rather than just a dumping of objects for people to like now make meaning out of. So I think like this new opportunity that we have with Web 3.0 and this NFT space is like something that's really, really important for me to investigate as a person who's been a cultural technologist for the past like decade, and seeing like how can African culture like participate and also like shift the conversation from how we're even thinking about NFTs right now in this like weird hoarding, flipping, speculative, weird capitalist, strange monster that it's become. So that's like basically what we want to do through Nandi. We want to, first of all, revolutionize the art global market, because still, like, we still have gatekeepers, most of them are in the West, who sort of give a cosign to an African artist for them to make money or meaning, where that should actually be coming from people who are interested in art. We want Nandi, and we want to have more opportunities for people who are interested in African art, directly patronizing, directly participating in the livelihoods the makers who are making this amazing culture that the whole world gets to benefit from. So that's basically what we're trying to do. And we want to like experiment and try to see like what kind of new creative economies can we create for Black creators across the globe, like not only African creators, but there is this like sort of African global culture that spans like outside the continent that has never really gotten resourced properly, that has never really gotten attention properly, that has just been like consumed and spat out. Like how can we like take things a step forward and see like ways in which we can resource and make sure that the people who are making amazing, incredible projects that are going to influence our future have an actual way to like survive and make a livelihood. Because if you think about the kind of money that was being thrown around during like the height of the NFT sort of madness, that could have a significant like change in somebody who's living in, for example, in Cameroon. If they sold an NFT for like $100,000, that's like life-changing money, like not only for that person, but like for that community. So that's sort of like, I think a big, huge overview about like who I am and like what I've been working on. And I'm just, yeah, I'm open for questions. And I wanted to show up, have a presentation, but also like have a conversation back and forth, because that's like basically how I also share the best ideas when I'm in conversation with someone. Yeah.
Definitely. But I think it's really important that you have given us this overview, because it's a really clear path of your career trajectory and where you are now. And I suppose what Nandi, as it is in this next phase, will represent not only for you, but also for all of the African digital artists. Because I think what you said at the end there is really important, that there's sort of more of a community focus on assets that is a cultural focus that is a little bit different than, say, someone coming from Australia or from America or from Western Europe. $100,000, that's not life-changing for a lot of people. You know, it's great, but it's not going to completely revolutionize your life or the life of those around you. I'm really amazed also by your focus on making, also in the physical and the tangible sense, because I think that is something so important. And I didn't know that you had started a school in Kenya, which sounds amazing. And I think that what you brought up actually around resources and resourcing from the African continent, say phone batteries coming out of Congo, that we have got resources within the African continent which are being mined or being tapped into and then being sent away for other countries to make profit out of. And trying to bring the sphere back, or trying to bring technology back into the African continent and trying to make makers in Africa, I think is so important in terms of creating innovation. And because through innovation, you create sustainability and sustainable practice for people to actually make their own decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that also having a relationship back with the continent can also give us a grip, because we're like, people in Western spaces are not healthier for being in this consumer iPhone 13, iPhone 25, iPhone 16, like constantly just like getting upgraded, just like the volume gets turned up, and like sort of divorcing ourselves from like humanity and like what it means like to have these components, and like where do these pieces come from? Like we're much more getting more obscured away from reality. And I think there's definitely a push for that. Like people are like, let's keep going. Let's even like escape the world and go into a metaverse in which we haven't really understood and clearly defined, and sort of lose our senses. Like I think that by having this connection back to our relationship with each other, because, you know, thanks to the World Wide Web, we are a global community. You know, we've always been a global community. Like we're sort of naturally designed that way. It's not because of a technology. I think as human beings, we've always sort of tried, we're always going to like inevitably try to form ourselves into communities. And I think also like what this past few years has shown is that we're trying to use technologies to like bring us back into community. But if we don't have a real sense of what that means, like if we're not intangible, like we're not participating in tangible, sensory, communal relationships with each other, I think that we're going to get more and more ill. Like we're going to exhibit more mental illnesses, more physical illnesses, more illnesses in terms of like even globally how we organize and think about things like war and things like, you know, like we're not going to be like a healthy society. So for me, like this is like such an important, this is why I think that like my passion has always been around art and digital art, because it translates not only to just like, oh, I'm observing something in a white cube wall and I'm just like sitting there and like looking at it, but it has like so many connections, like it has so many different variations. And the reason why like an art piece is an art piece is because we bring meaning to it. And that meaning comes like from our sense of like who we are and our sense of community. And I think more and more people, especially in Western spaces, are finding that their culture is like lacking something, is devoid of something, which I think is this connection back to, number one, the earth, back to each other, and back to like what's important. Like I find it's increasingly harder and more difficult and more expensive to be a human being, like, which is really, really crazy making if you think about it, because we have more food than we've ever had. We have much more security than we've ever had in human history. We have much more connection to each other. Like we're on Zoom, like we're in the future, man. Like I'm talking to you, I don't know, if thousands of miles away from me, but like we still have to continue being the practice of investing in these spaces, in these art spaces, in these art communities, to have like people to continue to ask us like, what does it mean to be a human? Like, what is the end goal of technologies? Like, what are things, and like, why are they important to us? And like, what is important to us? And I think like having spaces and having communities that are willing to ask those questions is only going to be something that is extremely of benefit for us. And of course, like it would be great if like we all sold an NFTs and became billionaires tomorrow. But then like to what end? Like we're gonna want to go to space, like we're gonna want to escape. Like, you know, it's like, you know, you know, so it's like really, really important for artist communities to like continue to ground themselves in like the purpose in which they create these spaces, the purpose in which they exist, because they are important. And I think I've been even in talks before, I think when people were panicking in the beginning of COVID, where people were like, what's the point of cultural institutions? Like, as like more and more cultural institutions were dying. And I think like it's not that like cultural institutions don't have a role, that they should all be dismissed, but perhaps like this is a time of reframing. This is a time of like inviting new kind of conversations, like of letting go of our egos and our like our need to be like cool and like know something that other people like don't know, and like invite like new voices and also young generations to like redefine that for us, because clearly we don't know. Clearly like what we've been participating in hasn't had like the impact and influence that we would like to believe.
Definitely.
You know? So,
I think that's really true, especially within the narratives around cultural institutions in, say, Western Europe, where you've got the canon, as they call it, of Western art, and the same story of this artwork is told from one art history class to the next art history class, and from that curator to the public. And it's this same repetition of the same story that's been handed down. And you end up with less viewership of those artworks because it's hard. People find it difficult to engage with it because it's so only contextualized through one narrative or one lens. And I suppose, and this is a conversation I have a lot with my colleagues around the need for diverse voices or diverse ideas when it comes to curatorship or when it comes to the way that we view art, that it can't just be categorized. You know, it was the categorization of art objects and of peoples that started this whole thing off, you know, with the world fairs back in the 19th century. Let's think everything's coming together. Like, we are human, we're sharing human stories. We need to be working together. And there's something really incredible about what African digital art sort of shows as well, though, is you've got all these incredible different artists from different parts of the continent, and they're all also sharing this need for representation, which I think is so wonderful to see in African digital art on this platform, that you've got this, I suppose it's a pan-cultural representation, you know, re-showing of people of color, of the physicality of people, which has been really, we've moved really far away from in a lot of other spaces, but in this platform, it's this like, I really see it as like a need to sort of, to actually represent oneself, and to sort of, and have ownership over that voice. Do you feel that way at all about the way that the artists on African digital art are creating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that also I feel trapped because because of the fact that it represents an entire continent. It would have been better if I was just doing Sierra Leonean,
Yeah.
artist. It's like such a massive, it's such a massive, Africa is such a massive continent to be so underrepresented, number one. And then also, one of the things that I wanted to do with ADA was just to show, and then invite other people to just like investigate on their own. Like, I was so cognizant of like how people who write about art also are sort of super self-selecting in terms of like their audience, how they write about art. It makes you feel like, oh, I don't have those artsy fartsy words to describe this. And also because a lot of African artists are just making out of either their passion or either out of like ideas that they want to represent. So who am I to come out of nowhere and say this art is this, and this is what it means, and this is what it belongs to. So like what I wanted to do, and that's even how like the website is designed, is for people to just dive in and to get lost in it, and to also invite them to keep finding more and like to explore it. The question about African art existing now is not even a thing, like that like that we move past like us thinking African art as some ancient thing where it's like a bunch of masks and like paintings and like scrolls from like centuries ago, for people to actually be like, wait, wow, African art is probably existing at the same time. People probably have the same access to tools and internet as I do. Like, what kind of things and stories are they saying? And like, I think that's like basically been primarily my job, is to sort of step away and just like invite people to just jump in and look at it, because it's undeniable. Like, the talent is undeniable. And 13 years now, I'm still like, I've not run out of I ran out of space. Like, but I don't run out of artists to feature. I don't run out of projects that inspire me. I don't run out of ideas that like change my thinking about like what it means for me to be from this continent, and like what kind of cultural inheritance that I have had like from centuries ago. Like, it's only encouraged me to like learn more about myself. And a lot of people from the continent, especially someone like me who's had the chance to live everywhere, I've always had this desire to connect back to myself, and that wasn't ready available. And it was some guy from like the 1900s telling me, oh, this is what Nandi culture is, or Kalin, it's just been so removed from who I am as a person that like I found the space in art and artists as like a new expression of like understanding like the depth of culture that from the places and spaces that I come from. And that's sort of why like I've sort of organized my thinking and ethos and philosophy and like continuing that on like 100 years from now. And I think that's also what led me also to be a farmer and to like start planting trees, like because I like planted in 2018-19, I planted like over 1,000 trees, and everybody thought I was going crazy. But I just thought, like, what a funny thing would it be like 50 years from now, or like 75 years from now, people be like, where the hell is this forest? Like, what is the most randomest forest here? Like, what happened? And I think like that's sort of even how the Amazon came to be, because it was like a bunch of folks who were experimenting with all sorts of things with agriculture that it ended up like overgrowing and becoming this resource of air. Like, and I think that we as like human beings, and especially as artists, like we can always have conversations with people from the future and from the past and the present. Like we have this like amazing way of like transcending time. And I know most African artists are always like sort of, especially Black artists, are sort of told to like revisit the past as a way of like trying to get all these pieces of this insomnia that we suffer. But I also find like the future much more exciting, that you can sort of drop these like random eggshells that people can like rediscover you and be like, oh wow, this person's like crazy. Like what were they thinking? What kind of, and I think that's a lot of even how I used to think that social media would be this way. Instagram, I wanted people to take Instagram like as a social experiment, as like a weird way of like making a myth out of their life, that like down the line somebody could discover after you're gone and be like, what is this person doing? Like, what were they into? Just like as an invitation to like imagine new things. And I think that that is something that I think the world needs definitely much more of, these practices of speculative dreaming, speculative thinking, just because a lot of the solutions that we're looking for are not in our world presently. They're not in the immediate way that we're presented to them. Like how a lot of the things that we're trying to do are like remnants of didn't work before, and it's giving us a sense of powerlessness. And I think this is like the opportunity that artists have by inviting people to like, you can let that go, like just like solve everything and just dream, make some, just for the sake of making it. Or it doesn't have to be useful, it doesn't have to make, it doesn't have to like make money, it doesn't have to do anything, it can just be something that makes sense to you. And like you never know from that, like what kind of influence and impact that you have. And I think that that's the thing that has always sort of kept me going. It's like this speculative imagination that we can all collectively participate in. Because when you look outside the window, when you look at the world in which we're living in, it seems like pretty awful and scary. And like also like you kind of wonder, are people humans? Like everybody seems to be acting sort of so strangely, but then we're only seeing it from a very specific lens. But if we create more spaces that we invite folks to dream and participate in which they can feel safe in, or like just do it for the sake of doing it, we don't know what kind of impact that has. And that's like basically the whole entire science fiction was. Like the entire science fiction genre was people just making stuff up until people like invented the stuff that people were making up. Like, that's exactly like the power of like creativity. Like, we are makers of our own realities. So like more and more Africans need to participate, more diverse folks need to participate. The West and other spaces need to like relinquish their need for like control or like feeling like they're dominating, and just allow folks to come in. And I think we're in a unique place because we've seen that like these spaces have like led us to like this horrible like, and that we're all trying to like reverse back to. So we are in like a really great place, I think, as artists, as digital artists, as creative technologists, to like really form and frame new paradigms that doesn't like have to be us like rocketing ourselves into Mars or somewhere and starting over again, like this escapism thing.
Oh,
I don't really understand.
And I love that idea though, that that sci-fi takes us to the future, and we're sort of creating the future, or the future that we're living now is in some ways the ideals or ideas of decades before, and that Africa is really well positioned now to put itself within the forefront of, okay, let's think about how a new future might look from a different perspective. We've got a few more minutes. I'd like to just do a shout out to anyone who would like to ask any questions, to pop them in the chat, and we'll try and get to them. If anyone has anything they'd like to ask, just type it in. I'd like to change up a bit and talk a little bit about exhibition spaces. So I know that you also work in exhibiting, not just working in the digital sphere. How do you find that coming out of digital and into physical exhibition, that process?
Yeah, this has been super tough for me. Just because I think I have a problem with the white cube space. Like I just generally, I feel like even the kind of artwork that you try to stuff in that white cube space it just falls flat, I feel, especially to African audiences. And digital art is like so guilty of that. Like we just love the biggest screen with the biggest speakers, with the biggest, we're just trying to make a big gigantic TV screen and like reproduce, if it's not that, like we love shiny, like flashy things. And like, and we sort of get excited about that shiny big screen space and never really understand like, okay, and then what? Like, okay, so now what exactly are you showing? And so like I've really taken it upon myself to avoid spaces like that. And that's why I'm part of this festival called Nyege Nyege that is actually occurring in the middle of the Nile, in the middle of nowhere. It's like a music festival that basically invites like all sorts of makers to just create this experience. Like, so you started completely from scratch out of nowhere, and you have a few days to like sort of build, and like thousands of people sort of attend and can interact and engage in different ways. And I think music has this way of doing that. Like music and sound has like a really interesting way of us getting outside of ourselves and thinking of like, we must be completely visual, we must completely explore things. And I think that's also what made me go into doing this podcast as well, because I found that the visual image was so limiting and so also reused, and so like people can, we're so inundated by visuals that we have such a high visual vocabulary that sometimes we can't let our imagination escape, because we say, oh, I saw a black fist, I get what that is, like, and then we just dismiss it and we don't even see past it. So I think that like sound is such an important medium that I think we can continue to use. I think that I think working in community will get ourselves away from these exhibition spaces. And thankfully, because of COVID, nobody really wants to be in a room with tons of people. So people have been like really interested in like creating different spaces outside of a cube. And that has also gone into the metaverse. The metaverse is also another thing where it's also like really, as a digital artist, I've been like, oh, this is all you guys came up? This seems like so early 2000s. The just sort of the imagination that we have over like, if we need to have an art exhibition, we must recreate the museum. Otherwise, people won't understand that it's art. Like we can't even like have spaces outside of the cube. So I think that this is still a new, it's still like a new environment that we can experiment. But I think one of the things that will help us break away from that is building with community. Like, and this community thing is, mark my words, community is like the biggest commodity that we're gonna have like for the next few years, because we're all in search of community. We've been locked away in boxes literally, and like have been told not to interact with each other. We're slowly trying to figure out ways of how to come out with that and how to be around that. And that's like a new ways for us to like break away from these weird boxes that we put ourselves in and like see what's possible. Yeah.
We've come to time. There's one question in our chat, which has come from Hizia Rumley asking, hello, I am an AI artist and I would like to join the community of African digital art. Is it possible?
Yes, it is possible. First of all, you can start with our website and go there. We also have a Discord that we've created for Nandi. We're also on Instagram, like African Digital Arts. You can find me at Digital African. And as we're rolling out, as we're dipping our feet into this NFT space, it's actually not really even about NFTs. It's more about us trying to visit, like trying to rebuild like our sense of community, global communities, how we can participate with artists much more, whether it's like doing interventions all over the world, whether it's like creating new metaverse spaces. Like that's something I'm like really interested in, something called building a digital festac, which Festac was this amazing African Black culture festival that happened in the 60s and 70s, when the rest of the world were like, oh my gosh, Africans, they have freedom, they don't even have culture. And then they've produced this amazing festival called Festac. And so we want to continue to have like cultural festivals in the metaverse as well. And we would love to have somebody who is in AI also participate in that. And also on ADA, African, you just reminded me, we're going to be interviewing people who are into machine learning, because that's also from a very specific white frame space that's been very scary for Africans and Black folks, like the kind of artificial intelligence that's been created. So there's a lot of folks outside of that kind of world who are reframing and rebuilding rhythms for artificial intelligence. So I would definitely start with African digital art, and you can find me on Digital African. Yeah, and we can keep the conversation going. Yes. Yeah.
I wish that we could keep the conversation going right now. You have got such a world of knowledge, and I think there's so many different ways that we can kind of approach this topic. But thank you for giving us an hour of your time. You've been incredible. And anyone who would like to watch or share, you can find this talk. It'll be up on the MISC Art Institute YouTube account. Thank you, Jepchumba, for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for inviting me from New Space. It's such an honor to have a conversation with you guys, and to share about what I'm doing, so that I don't feel like I've lost it. Because sometimes, like when you're in the world of world building, you feel like, am I the only one in the bunker? So it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation, and I would love for it to continue. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.